Mr. Walters gathered the seventh graders in the classroom to introduce a new way of telling stories using scientific style. He explained that using ratio and unit rate can make their stories more precise and easier to understand. Eden looked curious and asked, Mr. Walters, what exactly is a ratio? Mr. Walters smiled patiently and said, a ratio compares two quantities, like how many apples there are to oranges. Cash raised his hand eagerly and added, so, if I have 4 pencils and 8 erasers, what's the ratio of pencils to erasers? He nodded approvingly and replied, that's right, Cash. The ratio is 4 to 8, which simplifies to 1 to 2. Jacob listened carefully and then asked, how can I use ratios in real life? Mr. Walters responded, great question, Jacob. For example, if you're baking and using 2 cups of flour for every 1 cup of sugar, the ratio helps you measure correctly. Ania leaned forward and said, but what about unit rate? I don't understand how it's different. He explained, unit rate is a comparison of a quantity to 1 unit. For example, if you drive 120 miles in 3 hours, the unit rate is how many miles you drive per hour. Amber nodded and said, so in that case it would be 40 miles per hour? Mr. Walters smiled and said, exactly, Amber. That makes it easier to compare different things like prices or speed. Kelly asked, can you give us a real-life example of unit rate? He replied, sure. If a store sells 6 candies for $3, the unit rate is how much 1 candy costs? Neve chimed in, that would be, 50 per candy, right? He answered, yes, Neve, you're getting it. Understanding these concepts helps us make smarter choices. Timmy looked excited and said, so I can use ratios and unit rates to compare different video game prices? Mr. Walters nodded happily and said, exactly, Timmy. You can see which game gives you more fun for your money. Colin asked, how do ratios and unit rates help in sports? He explained, in sports, ratios can show stats like wins to losses, and unit rates can show average points scored per game. Eden looked thoughtful and said, this makes stories more interesting because I can include facts and numbers. Cash added, it's like telling a story about how much better my bike is because I can go twice as fast. Jacob smiled and said, I think I can use these ideas to explain my science project better. Mr. Walters clapped his hands and said, that's the spirit. Use ratio and unit rate to make your stories clearer. Anya asked, can we practice with some of these examples? He agreed and handed out worksheets with real-life scenarios for them to analyze ratios and unit rates. Amber eagerly started working on the worksheet, trying to figure out the unit rate for different cases. Kelly pointed out, if a marathon runner runs 26 miles in 4 hours, what's their average speed? He said, that's a perfect example, Kelly. Calculate the miles per hour. Neve quickly responded, it's 65 miles per hour, because 26 divided by 4 is 65. Timmy cheered, now I see how these math concepts can help us every day. Colin looked proud and said, I might even use this to compare my dad's different car fuel efficiencies. Mr. Walters nodded approvingly and said, exactly, Colin. Mathematics is everywhere, and stories make learning fun. Eden turned to her classmates and said, now I have a better way to tell stories about everyday things. Cash grinned and said, and I can make my science experiments more precise using ratios. Jacob said excitedly, I will include these ideas in my next science report to make it clearer. Anya nodded enthusiastically and said, learning this makes everything about math much more interesting. Amber clapped her hands and said, I can't wait to try using ratios and unit rates in real life. Kelly giggled and added, math can be fun when we see how it connects to the world around us. Nevaeh looked around and said, this lesson really helps us understand stories in a new way. Timmy smiled broadly and said, thanks to Mr. Walters, I'm ready to tell stories with facts and figures. Finally, Mr. Walters smiled warmly and said, excellent work, everyone. Keep practicing and you'll master these ideas quickly. He concluded, remember, science and math are powerful tools for telling stories about our world.